They say that sometimes the ones who've been hurt the most love the deepest. This story is not just about two dogs. It's about trust, healing, and the quiet power of unconditional love. At Vale Marks, we believe stories like this remind us of the strength that grows from connection even in the unlikeliest places. As you watch, remember the old saying, those who wander aren't always lost. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right heart to find them. This video holds a deeply meaningful lesson. Stay with us till the very end. The ending might just stay with you forever. The rain had been falling for hours, soaking the earth until it turned into a swamp of mud and scattered leaves. The town of Haven Ridge lay quiet in the distance, its soft golden lights barely visible through the curtain of water. Out at the edge of town, past the rows of houses and the rusting wire fences, beyond the railroad tracks and forgotten backyards, was a patch of overgrown woods and untended fields. Few people ventured out that far. Fewer still noticed the lone shadow that moved silently between the trees. A dog, large and powerful, with a thick coat of wet matted fur and amber eyes that missed nothing. Rust had made this place his home. He wasn't born wild. Once, long ago, he'd had a name, a collar, a family. But people had a way of turning cold when it mattered most. One day, the food stopped coming. The car door opened beside a ditch on a back road, and then silence. Rust had waited at first. Then he walked, far, long enough for hope to die and survival to take its place. Since then, he had trusted no one. Rust survived on instinct and grit. He knew which trash cans to check behind the diner on Mondays. He knew the sound of coyotes and how to keep out of their path. He knew not to trust humans, no matter how soft their voices or how kind their hands seemed. Everything he had fought for. Alone. And he liked it that way. But that night, that storm, changed everything. The rain came down harder, soaking Rust's thick fur and weighing down the tall grass around him. He had taken shelter beneath the rusted frame of an abandoned truck, his body curled tight against the chill. That's when he heard it. A sound. Small, weak, a whimper. Rust's ears perked, his body stilling. The wind howled through the trees, but the sound came again. A soft, broken cry, barely audible over the rain. Something was out there. Something hurt. Rust didn't move at first. He'd learned not to get involved. The world was cruel, and weakness meant danger. But the sound wouldn't stop. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, nudged him forward. He moved through the dark like a shadow, paws sinking into mud, nose twitching against the wet air. The scent hit him before he saw it. Fur, blood, fear. Then there it was, a puppy, lying half-submerged in the mud beside a fallen log, shivering violently, whimpering in pain. Its fur, once a golden brown, was plastered to its body, streaked with grime and blood. One paw was twisted at an odd angle. Its ribs showed through its skin. Rust froze. Everything in him said turn away, walk on. He didn't need this. But the puppy, its eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locked onto Rust. There was no bark, no growl, just a quiet, desperate gaze, helpless. And somehow, that was worse than a cry. Rust took a step closer. The pup tensed, then whimpered again. It was too weak to move, too cold to fight. It simply lay there, a breathing pile of bones and fur. Rust looked around. The woods offered no shelter, no warmth, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. He didn't know why he did it. Not really. Maybe it was the way the pup's body trembled. Maybe it was the ghost of a memory, buried deep beneath layers of pain and distrust. Whatever it was, it made him lower his body beside the puppy, curling his thick frame around the shivering form. The puppy pressed against him immediately, burying its face into Rust's damp chest. It was like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in wet paper. Rust stiffened. This was not his way. He didn't do this. Closeness, contact, care. And yet, he stayed. All night, The rain poured, wind shook the trees, thunder rolled across the hills, and in the middle of it all, under a low canopy of dripping branches, two strays, one big, one small, shared a silence that spoke more than words ever could. Rust kept watch, eyes half closed, ears twitching with every distant sound. The pup, exhausted and comforted, eventually drifted into sleep. Its breathing was uneven but no longer panicked. Rust could feel the warmth of its fragile body against his side. Fragile, yet somehow still alive. He didn't sleep. Not really. He was too used to danger, too trained by hardship to let down his guard. But something in him softened, just enough to let the moment linger. By morning, the rain slowed to a mist, the world hushed in its aftermath. The puppy stirred. Rust nudged it gently with his nose. The pup blinked up at him, eyes clearer than before. It let out a soft, hoarse whine and tried to stand. Its legs wobbled, then collapsed. Rust waited. The pup looked up at him again, and in that look, there was something else now. Trust. Rust turned his gaze toward the distant town of Haven Ridge, where smoke curled from chimneys and food scents drifted on the breeze. He didn't like people, but this pup? It wouldn't survive another night out here. Rust took a breath, then started walking. Behind him, the puppy struggled to its feet and limped after him, one shaky step at a time. And so, the journey began. The forest was quiet that morning, wrapped in the soft dampness that follows a night of heavy rain. Mist curled low around the tree trunks, and the sun, if it had risen at all, was only a faint glow behind thick gray clouds. Rust stood still for a long time, staring at the faint path ahead. Behind him, the pup stirred. Duke. That's what Rust had decided to call him, not out loud, of course. Rust didn't speak. He didn't know human words, nor did he care to learn them. But something about this pup, the stubborn glint in his eyes, the little growl he gave when he tried to walk, deserved a name. And Duke seemed to fit. The journey ahead would be rough. The woods stretched for miles before giving way to the outer edges of Haven Ridge, where food might be found, where humans might offer help, or danger. Rust had never trusted people, and he had no intention of marching into town with a limping puppy and begging for scraps. But Duke couldn't survive out here. Not without help, not even with Rust's help. So Rust made a decision. One paw in front of the other, he stepped onto the faint trail winding through the forest. Behind him, Duke struggled to his feet, legs trembling, and began to follow. The first hour was slow. Duke limped, dragging his injured paw behind him. He tripped over roots, stumbled through puddles, and collapsed more than once. Rust would stop each time, watching silently as the pup tried again. Only when Duke looked up at him with those tired eyes would Rust return, nudge him gently with his nose, and wait until the pup found his footing again. They traveled like that, slow, cautious, quiet. The forest was alive with sound. Birds called from high branches, squirrels darted between trunks. Once a fox passed by, pausing only briefly to glance at them before vanishing into the underbrush. Rust remained alert. He knew these woods better than most. He knew where old traps were hidden, where hunters sometimes set bait. Danger wasn't always loud. It crept, it waited. Duke, on the other hand, seemed unaware of the danger. He sniffed the air with wide eyes, his ears perking up at every sound. It was the first time Rust saw curiosity in him, something other than pain or fear. The pup had spirit, even if his legs couldn't keep up with it. By midday, they had made little progress. Rust's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since the day before, and Duke looked even worse. His belly sunken, his steps growing slower with each hour. They needed food. Rust scanned the area, his nose twitching. He caught the scent of something, small, moving fast through the brush. A mouse. He lowered his body to the ground, muscles coiled, and pounced. The kill was quick. Rust bit cleanly, ending it in a blink. He hadn't hunted in front of anyone in a long time. Usually, he ate alone. He liked it that way. But now, with Duke watching him, muddy, panting, eyes wide with hunger, Rust hesitated. He turned back toward the pup who had collapsed again in the shade of a crooked tree. Rust patted over and dropped the mouse at Duke's paws. It wasn't much, barely a few bites, but it was all they had. Duke stared at it for a moment, as if unsure what to do. Then slowly, he leaned forward and began to eat. Small, careful bites. His tail thumped weakly in the dirt. Rust sat beside him, watching. Something stirred in him, a strange warmth, unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Sharing was dangerous. Sharing created bonds, and bonds could be broken. But Rust stayed. They rested for a while beneath the tree. The sky had begun to clear, allowing pale beams of sunlight to fall through the leaves. Duke curled up close to Rust without hesitation this time. He didn't tremble as much. His breathing was more even. Rust didn't move away. That afternoon, they walked again, Rust leading, Duke following close behind. The path grew rockier, winding up through narrow ridges and fallen logs. At one point, Duke misjudged a leap and landed hard on his side. He yelped, and for a terrifying moment, didn't move. Rust rushed back, pushing his snout against the pup's side until Duke groaned and opened his eyes. Alive, but shaken. Rust lay down beside him until the pup could stand again. This time, Duke leaned against him as they walked. Just a little, but enough to matter. As evening approached, the forest grew darker, cooler. They found a dry patch beneath a low-hanging tree, the earth soft and mossy. Rust circled twice before settling down. Duke collapsed beside him, exhausted. They slept pressed together, the pup's head resting on Rust's back. No longer strangers, no longer alone. Rust didn't know when the change had happened. He couldn't name it. But somewhere between the first muddy step and the shared meal, something had shifted. He wasn't just protecting the pup. He cared. Not in the way humans use the word, but in the way animals know. The quiet kind of care. The kind that watches and waits and stands guard through the night. The kind that doesn't run when things get hard. In Duke's sleep, his paw twitched. Rust looked at him, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. In the distance, beyond the trees, beyond the edge of this worn-down world, was the town, Haven Ridge. There were risks waiting there, but there was also hope. And now, Rust wasn't walking toward it alone. He had Duke, and Duke had him. By the third day, the woods began to thin, their protective shadows giving way to wider spaces and unfamiliar scents. Rust moved with caution, ears alert, nose twitching as the world around him shifted. He could sense it. They were close. Closer than ever to the edge of Haven Ridge. The forest no longer muffled the sounds of the human world. In the distance, cars rumbled along wet roads. Dogs barked behind fences. A lawnmower buzzed faintly, and children's laughter occasionally drifted through the breeze. These weren't forest sounds. They were town sounds. And they meant one thing: danger. Rust had lived near the edges of Haven Ridge long enough to understand the risks. Humans meant unpredictability. Some were kind, most were not. Some fed strays. Others chased them off with shouts or sticks. Rust had been on the receiving end of both. But Duke didn't know that. The little shepherd pup wagged his tail at every unfamiliar scent, every new sound. He didn't yet understand the weight of the world, not the way Rust did. That morning had started rough. Duke was struggling more than usual. The limp he'd managed to push through on the first 2 days had grown worse. He tripped over even the smallest roots, stumbled over rocks, and more than once, simply collapsed from exhaustion. Rust never strayed far. Each time Duke fell behind, Rust would stop and wait, turning back with a look that said, "Try again." And Duke would. His spirit was stronger than his body, but the strain was catching up to him. By midday, they reached the edge of the woods, where trees gave way to patches of open field. Rust slowed, his body low to the ground, scanning the surroundings. There were fences now and paved driveways, and the faint scent of smoke from chimneys. They were at the outskirts of town. Havenridge stretched beyond the hills, peaceful and quiet under an overcast sky. Rust knew they couldn't just walk in. He kept to the tall grass, eyes sharp, every step measured. Duke tried to follow, but his pace had slowed to a crawl. His legs trembled with each step. Eventually, he just stopped, his body gave out, and he sank into the dirt, breathing heavily, tail still thumping once, weakly. Rust approached, nose touching the pup's head. Duke looked up, eyes cloudy but trusting. He wanted to keep going, but his body said otherwise. Rust turned his gaze to the homes scattered nearby. Most were older houses, white paint peeling from wooden panels, sagging porches, wind chimes swaying in the breeze. Gardens, some tidy, others wild with overgrowth, lined the backyards. One house stood out. It sat at the corner of the block, modest and quiet. The fence around it was low and covered in ivy. Behind it was a garden, overgrown but full of life. Bushes heavy with flowers, tangled vines reaching toward the sky, and a small wooden bench beneath a tree. It didn't look threatening. It looked gentle. Rust's instincts prickled. He sniffed the air. No immediate sign of other animals. No barking, just the soft smell of soil and blossoms. This might be it. A place to rest. A place to hide. Rust nudged Duke gently. The pup tried to move but collapsed again. Rust hesitated, then grabbed the loose fur at the pup's scruff with his teeth and dragged him slowly toward the fence. It wasn't easy. Rust was tired too, but inch by inch, he got Duke to the edge of the yard. There was a break in the fence, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Rust led the way, then helped Duke through. Inside, the garden wrapped around them like a cocoon. Tall flowers formed a living wall, offering cover from the street. The earth was soft, and the shade from a nearby tree gave relief from the afternoon sun. Duke lay there, curled into a loose ball, his eyes already closing. His breaths were shallow, but he was safe. For now. Rust didn't settle. He stood near the edge of the garden, partly concealed by tall sunflowers and brush, eyes fixed on the house. His ears twitched at every sound, a bird, a gust of wind, the creak of a wooden step. He was alert, coiled like a spring, ready to run if needed. Then a new sound, footsteps, light, skipping. The back door creaked open, and out stepped a girl. She couldn't have been more than 9, with freckles on her cheeks and a loose braid falling over one shoulder. In her hands was a sketchbook and a fistful of colored pencils. She walked toward the bench beneath the tree, humming softly, unaware that just beyond the flowers, 2 pairs of eyes were watching her. Rust stayed still. The girl, Sarah, sat down, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw. Her eyes wandered the garden as if looking for inspiration. That's when she saw him. Not Rust. Duke. A small gasp escaped her lips as she dropped her pencils and scrambled toward the puppy lying in the grass. "Oh, no!" She crouched beside him, gently touching his side. Duke stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Sarah's face twisted with worry, and she called out, "Mom! Dad! Come here, quick!" Rust tensed. The back door opened again. A woman's voice answered, followed by a man's heavier footsteps. Sarah stood up and waved them over. Rust backed into the shadows, hidden completely now, but watching everything. The woman knelt beside Duke, inspecting him with gentle hands. The man stood behind her, phone in hand, already calling someone. perhaps a vet, perhaps animal control. Rust didn't know. But he stayed, because Duke didn't cry out. He didn't try to run. He looked calm, safe. His tail, thin and weak, tapped the ground once. Rust watched as they carefully picked up the pup and carried him inside the house, wrapped in a soft blanket Sarah had brought from the porch. And then it was quiet. The garden stood still again. The wind rustled the flowers. The sun shifted behind the clouds. Rust didn't follow. Not yet. He sat there in the tall grass, just beyond the reach of human hands, watching the door where Duke had disappeared. His body stayed tense, but his eyes softened. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, he dared to hope. Sarah had always loved animals. Ever since she could walk, she had filled her notebooks with drawings of dogs, cats, rabbits, and every other creature she could imagine. Her bedroom walls were lined with posters of puppies and horses, and her favorite stuffed toy, a scruffy golden retriever named Max, hadn't left her bed in years. So when she found the small, fragile puppy lying in the overgrown garden behind her house, her heart skipped a beat. He looked like he'd been through a storm, because he had. Mud matted his fur, his sides heaved with labored breath, and one paw was tucked beneath him at a strange angle. His ribs showed through his thin coat, but his eyes, those were still bright, still pleading, still hopeful. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dropped her sketchbook and ran toward him. "Mom! Dad!" she shouted, crouching next to the pup, her small hands hovering uncertainly above his tiny body. "There's a dog! He's hurt!" Her parents, Thomas and Ellie, were just inside, sipping coffee and talking quietly in the kitchen. When they heard her cries, they rushed out, worry etched across their faces. Thomas reached the pup first, kneeling down to inspect him. "Poor guy," he muttered. "He's in bad shape." Ellie appeared behind him with a blanket already in hand. Together, they gently lifted the trembling body from the grass, cradling it like a newborn as they carried him inside. Sarah followed close behind, her fingers twisted into the hem of her shirt, heart pounding in her chest. They laid the pup down on a towel in the laundry room, where it was warm and dry. Ellie grabbed a bowl of warm water, a few soft cloths, and began wiping away the mud. Thomas filled a small dish with leftover chicken and rice from the fridge. The puppy was cautious at first, but hunger overcame fear. He ate in slow, shaky bites, lifting his head just enough to drink the water offered. Sarah sat nearby, cross-legged on the floor, watching every movement with wide, silent eyes. "What should we call him?" Ellie asked gently. "Duke," Sarah said without thinking. "He looks like a duke." The name stuck. That night, Duke lay wrapped in an old quilt near the heater in the laundry room, fast asleep. Sarah checked on him 3 times before bedtime, whispering good night each time. But she hadn't forgotten about the other one. She had seen him, or at least glimpsed him. A larger dog, dark-colored, watching from the shadows as they took Duke inside. He hadn't moved. He hadn't barked. But she had felt his presence like a quiet weight pressing against the edges of the garden. Sarah woke early the next morning and quietly tiptoed into the kitchen. She took a clean bowl from the cupboard and filled it with some of Duke's food. Then, without a word, she slipped outside. The morning air was crisp. Dew clung to the grass. The garden stood still, hushed, as if waiting. Sarah walked to the edge of the porch and placed the bowl down carefully. She looked toward the bushes, where she thought she had seen eyes the night before. "I know you're there," she whispered, her voice light and steady. "This is for you. You helped Duke. I saw you." She stepped back and sat cross-legged on the porch, watching, waiting. But nothing came. Not that morning, or the next. But Sarah didn't give up. Every morning and evening she brought out a fresh bowl, sometimes filled with chicken, sometimes kibble, sometimes a bit of scrambled egg if her mom let her. She always sat nearby, humming or talking softly, never pushing, never trying to approach, and slowly, it began to work. The first sign was a bowl licked clean when she returned from school. Then, paw prints in the dirt. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the garden, she saw him, just for a second. A dark shape slipping through the flowers, pausing to sniff the food before disappearing again. Rust. She didn't know his name, of course, not yet, but she spoke to him anyway. "It's okay," she'd say. "You're safe here." And little by little, he began to believe her. Rust never came inside the house. He never let his guard down fully. But over the course of several days, he started appearing more often, first at dusk, then earlier in the day. He began watching from the edge of the garden as Sarah played with Duke, who had grown stronger, more playful, more alive. Then one morning, Sarah opened the back door and found Rust lying on the porch. Not asleep, but resting, his eyes half-lidded, body still tense, but there. She moved slowly, crouching a few feet away. "Hi," she whispered. "You're okay." Rust didn't move. He didn't growl or flee. He just stared at her, steady and calm. With the same care she used when holding a baby bird, Sarah reached out and gently touched the edge of his paw. Rust flinched, but only slightly. He didn't pull away. From that moment on, he started sleeping on the porch every night. He wouldn't come inside, but he didn't have to. He was close. He was watching. He was part of the circle now. And Sarah, with her quiet patience and open heart, had made that possible. She didn't need to trap him or tame him. She just let him be. She offered kindness without expectation. And that was what Rust had needed most. Trust, once broken, is slow to return. But Sarah, just 9 years old, had found a way to bring it back. One bowl of food, one gentle touch, one moment at a time. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream, soft, slow, and gently colored by sunlight and laughter. For the first time in a long while, Rust had no need to run. He still kept his distance, of course. It was in his nature. But little by little, the tension in his body eased. His ears didn't twitch with every creak of the floorboards. His eyes no longer scanned for exits. And most importantly, his heart, once guarded like a locked door, had started to crack open. And the ones who had helped open it? A golden pup with an unstoppable spirit, and a little girl who believed love was enough. Duke recovered quickly under Sarah's care. Within a week, his limp had lessened, his ribs were harder to see, and his eyes shone with that unmistakable energy only young dogs possess. Every morning, as soon as Sarah opened the back door, Duke was already waiting, tail thumping excitedly, ears perked, ready for whatever the day might bring. They played tag in the backyard, Duke bounding through the tall grass like a clumsy deer while Sarah shrieked with laughter, darting behind flower bushes and ducking under laundry lines. Sometimes she'd toss an old tennis ball, and Duke would chase it eagerly, though he rarely brought it back. He preferred chewing on it in victory. Rust watched all of this from the sidelines. At first, he would lay under the shade of the maple tree, paws crossed, pretending to nap but never closing his eyes. He watched every move Sarah made, every bounce Duke took. He listened to her giggles, her soft humming as she walked through the garden barefoot. He listened to the sound of Duke's paws padding across the earth. And then one day, she called to him. "Rust! Come on! Come play with us!" He blinked. She said it again, this time clapping her hands and crouching low. Duke ran over to her, licking her face and wagging his tail as if to say, "Come on! What are you waiting for?" Rust didn't move at first, but curiosity, just a flicker, nudged him forward. He took a few tentative steps, his body low, his ears twitching. Sarah didn't rush him. She just smiled and patted the grass beside her. That was all it took. Rust trotted over slowly and sat a few feet away, not close enough to touch, but close enough to be near. That small step meant everything. From that day on, Rust became a quiet presence in all their games. He never chased the ball, never wrestled like Duke did, but he was there, always there. If Duke strayed too far, Rust was the one to bark and herd him back. If a bird startled Sarah, Rust would be by her side in seconds, tail stiff, ready to defend. Sarah, Thomas, and Ellie all noticed the change, so they made it official. They set out 2 dog bowls, one marked Duke, and the other hand-painted by Sarah with Rust in big blue letters. They placed a second dog bed on the porch, right beside Duke's. Thomas installed a small wooden gate at the garden's edge to make sure both dogs stayed safe. Ellie even added a soft blanket to the porch swing, where Sarah liked to sit and read aloud while the dogs lay at her feet. Rust never came inside the house, but he didn't need to. The porch had become his place. The garden was his haven. He had found something he didn't even know he'd been searching for, a quiet, unspoken sense of belonging. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft strokes of orange and pink, Sarah curled up on the porch swing with a book in her lap. Duke was already there, his head resting lazily on her thighs, eyes half closed. Rust approached slowly, watching them for a moment. Then, without a sound, he stepped forward and lay down beside them. He rested his head gently on the wooden floor, just beneath Sarah's dangling feet. She looked down, smiled, and reached out with one hand. Her fingers brushed softly through the fur between Rust's ears. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes. The porch fell into a peaceful hush. A breeze rustled the wind chimes. The smell of dinner floated from the kitchen window. Fireflies blinked lazily in the tall grass. It was a perfect moment, small and simple, but whole. Thomas stepped outside with a glass of lemonade, pausing as he took in the scene. His daughter, sandwiched between 2 very different dogs, one playful and bright, the other quiet and strong. And yet, somehow, they fit. Ellie joined him a moment later, wrapping her arms around his. "They look like a family," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "They are." That night, Sarah slept with a smile on her face. Duke curled up beside her bed, and Rust stretched out on the porch, the stars above twinkling like watchful eyes. Rust had come a long way from the cold, wet woods where he had once guarded his heart like a fortress. Now, he guarded something else, a girl, a pup, a home. Autumn had begun to settle over Haven Ridge, painting the trees in golden hues and brushing the air with a crisp chill that hinted at the coming winter. Leaves scattered across the garden like little paper boats, and the once tall summer grass had thinned and turned brittle beneath playful paws. Duke had grown stronger, his limp now barely noticeable as he bounded through the backyard. Rust remained ever watchful, never straying far from the porch, his calm, steady presence grounding the little world they'd built. To Sarah, it felt like everything had fallen into place. Her days were filled with joy, chasing Duke, reading books on the porch with Rust nearby, feeling the quiet hum of belonging that came from being surrounded by love, both human and canine. She had never imagined her life with dogs before, but now she couldn't picture her world without them. But while Sarah saw only the beauty in their growing family, her parents, Thomas and Ellie, were watching with more cautious eyes. They loved both dogs, truly. They admired Duke's energy and adored Rust's loyalty. But they were also adults, and they couldn't ignore the reality. Rust, as gentle as he had proven himself to be, was still a large Pitbull. He required more than a backyard garden and a porch to stretch out on. He needed space, real space, where he could run freely, burn off the quiet strength that simmered beneath his calm surface. And more than that, he needed someone who could give him full attention. Thomas brought it up one evening after Sarah had gone to bed. He sat with Ellie at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, his expression thoughtful. "He deserves more than this," he said quietly, nodding toward the window where Rust was curled up on the porch. Ellie sighed, her heart heavy. "I know." They didn't want to lose him, not after everything. But love, they knew, wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it meant letting go. That weekend, Thomas made a phone call to someone he trusted, Ben, his cousin who owned a small farm just 20 minutes outside of Haven Ridge. Ben was no stranger to dogs. He'd raised shepherds and retrievers, even trained a few for search and rescue. His land stretched for acres, rolling hills, fields, and quiet woods. When Thomas explained the situation, Ben didn't hesitate. "Bring him out," he said. "He'll have a good home here." The next morning, Sarah was helping Ellie fold laundry when her father knelt down beside her. "Honey," he said gently, "can we talk?" She looked up, eyes bright and innocent. He took a breath. "It's about Rust." Her smile faded. "Is he okay?" "He's okay," Thomas assured her quickly. "But your mom and I have been thinking. We love having Rust here. We do. But he needs more space than we can give him. He needs to run, to explore, to live somewhere with wide-open fields and fewer fences." Sarah's face crumpled. "You mean he has to leave?" Thomas nodded slowly. "We've spoken with Ben. Remember him? He has a big farm and lots of room. He's really good with dogs. He'd take great care of Rust." Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. "But Rust is ours. He's part of our family." Ellie came over and knelt beside them. "We know, sweetheart, and we love him too. But this isn't goodbye forever. Ben lives close by. We'll visit, and he said you can come see Rust whenever you want." Sarah wiped her eyes. Her chest felt tight. She looked toward the porch where Rust was resting, unaware of the storm brewing inside her heart. She didn't want him to go. But deep down, beneath the ache and the tears, she understood. He had once lived wild and free. Maybe this small backyard, even with all its love, wasn't enough. That night she sat beside Rust on the porch, her head resting against his thick shoulder. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she whispered. Rust didn't move, but his eyes turned to her slowly, as if he understood every word. "I'm going to miss you," she said. "So much." Duke lay nearby, sensing the change. He didn't bark or play that evening. He simply curled closer to Rust, placing one paw over the older dog's, and laid his head on Rust's side. The silence between them was filled with something heavy but gentle: acceptance. The next morning, Ben arrived in his truck. He greeted Sarah kindly, knelt down to scratch Duke behind the ears, and then turned to Rust. Rust didn't flinch or run. He stood slowly, walked to Ben, and sniffed his outstretched hand. There was something familiar in the man's scent: earth, hay, the open air. Rust sensed no threat, only steadiness. Ben opened the back of the truck, where a large dog crate lined with blankets waited. "It's just for the ride," he said gently. "He won't be locked up again after this." Sarah hugged Rust tightly before he climbed in. She buried her face in his neck, holding on as long as she could. "You're still part of us," she whispered. "Always." When the truck pulled away, Duke barked softly as if to say goodbye. Sarah stood on the porch, hand in her father's, eyes following the truck until it vanished down the road. She didn't cry anymore. She just hoped, with all her heart, that Rust knew how much he was loved, and that somehow he'd find his way back. Weeks passed. The days grew shorter, the wind a little colder, and the leaves that had once painted the town of Haven Ridge in fiery golds and reds now carpeted the sidewalks in shades of brown. Sarah missed Rust every single day. There was a space beside the porch where he used to lie, head resting between his paws, watching the world with those quiet, thoughtful eyes. It was empty now. And though Duke had returned to his playful self, bounding through the yard, chasing squirrels, barking at passing bicycles, there was always a moment, just before bedtime, when he would pause by the porch gate, glance out at the road, and whimper softly, as if he, too, was waiting. Ben had kept his promise. He sent photos and short videos of Rust playing in the fields, his tail high, his stride strong. In one clip, he was running full speed across an open hill, Duke's old tennis ball clutched proudly in his mouth. Another showed him curled up by a fireplace inside Ben's farmhouse, snoring softly. "He's happy," Ben said on the phone one evening, "but I think he still remembers." Sarah smiled at the thought. "I remember too." And then, one Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. Thomas walked into the kitchen holding an envelope, a small but official-looking one. He handed it to Ellie, who opened it while Sarah munched on cereal at the table. Her mother's eyes lit up. "It's from the county," Ellie said. "Ben's land just got rezoned. They're building a small road extension that'll connect our neighborhood to his part of town. They're even opening up a few new lots nearby." Thomas grinned. "And guess what? One of those lots is available." Sarah's spoon dropped into her bowl. "Wait, what does that mean?" "It means," Ellie said, kneeling beside her daughter, "we've decided to move." Sarah blinked. "Move? But why?" Thomas smiled. "Because Rust belongs with us, with you. And we found a perfect little house, just a few minutes from Ben's farm." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. Then she flung her arms around both her parents, laughing and crying at the same time. They spent the next few weeks packing. Duke, sensing the change, grew restless but excited. Boxes piled up in corners, and Sarah made sure to label one "Rust Stuff," even if it only contained an old towel he used to sleep on, a worn toy ball, and the food bowl she had painted for him. The new house was small but cozy. It sat at the edge of a gravel road lined with pine trees, just a short walk from Ben's farmhouse. On the day they arrived, Sarah didn't even unpack. She dropped her bags at the front door, whistled for Duke, and sprinted down the dirt path barefoot, her hair flying behind her like a kite string. She reached Ben's gate breathless, her heart pounding. "Rust!" she called, voice breaking. There was a pause. Then, from behind the barn, he appeared. Rust stood still for a moment as if making sure it was really her. Then, in one powerful bound, he took off across the yard, dirt kicking up beneath his paws. Sarah opened her arms and dropped to her knees. Rust didn't slow down. He barreled into her, gently but full of love, his tail whipping the air like a flag. He nuzzled into her chest, whining softly, licking her cheeks as if trying to make up for every second they'd been apart. Duke arrived seconds later, barking joyfully, leaping into the reunion with clumsy excitement. The three of them, girl, pup, and protector, tumbled into the grass, laughing, barking, wagging, and crying. They were whole again. Later that afternoon, Ben walked them to the property line and watched as Sarah led both dogs home. He waved as Rust paused to glance back, then smiled as the Pitbull turned and continued forward, his steps lighter than Ben had ever seen. From that day on, everything changed. Mornings began with both dogs at the front door, tails wagging in sync. Sarah took them on walks through the nearby woods, where Rust would lead the way, and Duke followed close behind. Evenings were spent on the porch, where Sarah read books aloud while the dogs lay curled at her feet, Rust always closest, Duke usually snoring softly. The porch swing was their favorite place. Sometimes Rust would rest his head on Sarah's lap, just as he had that first fall. Other times he'd let Duke do it, choosing instead to sit beside them, his presence calm and constant. There were still hard days, of course. Rust remained cautious with strangers. And Duke, ever the energetic pup, still had to learn boundaries. But within the little white house near the pines, there was peace. There was laughter. There was love. They were, all of them, a family. And if you ever happened to pass that house, especially on a late summer evening when the sun dipped low and the fireflies danced, you might catch a glimpse of a little girl and two dogs sitting together on the porch. One playful and bright, one strong and steady, and a girl whose heart had room for them both. Because sometimes, the most broken hearts build the strongest bonds, and sometimes, the best kind of home is the one you build together. Thank you for watching this emotional journey, one of loss, love, and homecoming. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Vale Marks. Your support helps us reach our dream of 1,000 subscribers, and more importantly, it gives us the strength to keep creating meaningful, heartfelt content that brings people and animals closer together. As Maya Angelou once said, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." If this story made you feel, leave us a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say hello. Because at Vale Marks, stories don't end when the video does. They live on in the hearts of those who believe in them.